You are listening to the Marc Guzman Podcast Experience. Before we get started, just a friendly reminder that you can find all of my available properties on my website at marcguzman.com. You can also find an archive of all of our past podcast episodes. Hello, podcast listeners. This is Marc Guzman, and this is part 2 of the CAR Spring Meeting Conference I recently attended. Now, I am back full in swing in property management, back to work, catching up on work. If you're interested in any of my services, both home sales and property management, visit my website at marcguzman.com. But this is going to be a very short part 2 episode, but the whole goal of it is going to be to run down the various Assembly and Senate bills that are going through the state legislature in California right now that will be affecting real estate down the road. So if you're a real estate agent, a landlord, a tenant, you need to listen to this because this will affect you and your property and your clients. Okay, so number one, right off the bat, the biggest item that's going to be on the November ballot is the Costa-Hawkins Repeal Act. It's actually going to be labeled as expands local government authority to enact rent control on residential property. So this is the Costa-Hawkins repeal. Now, this is something that I've been talking about on various of my podcast episodes recently. Just to give you the quick rundown. Currently, Costa-Hawkins protects your property if it was built after 1996 or if it's a single family home or condo. The Costa-Hawkins Act prevents your property from being under rent control. So if a city, for example, recently, city of Richmond, California, passed rent control and a just cause ordinance, the just cause portion applies to your single family home and condo, but the rent control does not. Or if you have a newer building, maybe you have a fourplex that was built in 2000, well, you're exempt from rent control. If Costa-Hawkins gets repealed, then cities can expand rent control to every single rental property in their jurisdiction. Now, the potential negative downside to this can go a step further. So Costa-Hawkins also has a section in the law right now that allows for a landlord in a rent control building for vacancy decontrol. So for example, if your rent control apartment is renting for $1,000 a month and it's worth $2,000 a month on the open market, well, you can only raise it usually 2 or 3% every single year. Now, if your tenant paying $1,000 a month leaves the property, Costa-Hawkins allows you to then take it up to market. So that's called vacancy decontrol. So now you can put it back on the market for $2,000. Now, I don't know if you can hear that, but my cats are fighting. So Costa-Hawkins allows vacancy decontrol, and you can take that back up to market. Now, with Costa-Hawkins being repealed, what can potentially happen is cities that have rent control in their jurisdictions, and they can then expand their rent control ordinance to then require that a landlord cannot take that unit back up to market, which means you may forever be stuck with a rent control unit at $1,000 a month. And once it goes vacant, you can't raise it up to market. You have to re-rent it at $1,000 a month or whatever the prior tenant was paying. This is not good because imagine there's not going to be any incentive to fix up a place. A tenant's going to move out and a landlord's just going to put it back on the market without doing any repairs, upgrades, or even cleaning. Many landlords are just not going to care about bringing the condition of the unit up to par for market. So this is not good on so many different levels. It's really going to make a lot of people scared to even rent out their single family homes because they don't know if they're ever going to be able to
raise rents if the markets are getting better. And right now, the big topic of rent control is huge because rent prices keep going up. But what happens when the cycle turns around and then prices go down? I mean, real estate goes into cycles and prices go down, but then we're stuck with all these rent control laws that were enacted because of very quick, very one-sided motivation to correct an issue that rent control obviously does not fix. So that's something to watch on the November ballot. Another thing, Senate Bill 721. Now, this would require any building, any property with 3 or more units that have balconies, walkways, or any elevated structures over 6 feet to be inspected every 6 years. Now, this law came out from the tragic incident that happened in Berkeley where several college students died from a balcony collapsing. So now they're going to make this statewide. It looks like it's about to pass, and it would require an inspection every 6 years. Now, the problem with the way this is currently written up is that it would require a destructive inspection. So you would have to have a contractor go out to the property. If the balcony or the walkway looks fine, they cannot give an okay on it. They actually have to destroy at least 15% of it and get inside of it to find out if it's rotted or if there's interior damage. At that point, you then have to repair it. So these are going to be very costly inspections because it's going to require that the contractor destroy a section of the walkway balcony to then give the okay on it and then have to repair it. So unfortunately, this is something that looks like it's going to pass and we're going to be stuck with it. So it will require an inspection every 6 years. If there's damage that's found, you as a landlord would be required to fix it within 120 days. After 120 days, if you haven't fixed it, the fine is $100 to $500 per day based on the city jurisdiction and what they want to charge you. Okay, Senate Bill 1427. This is an interesting one, and this would make it mandatory for people to accept veteran and military status housing vouchers. So something that I haven't really seen here in the Bay Area, but it happens statewide at different levels, is that there's many landlords that will discriminate against veterans or military status because they are coming in with military or veteran housing vouchers. And similar to Section 8 housing vouchers, many landlords across state will tell them no for whatever reason. And up until now, you as a landlord are not required to accept housing vouchers. Now, of course, there's cities like San Francisco that have already changed their laws to where, for example, in San Francisco, you cannot discriminate against a Section 8 housing voucher. But statewide, they've never really had any kind of law that would prohibit discrimination against veteran or military status housing voucher. Now, we're all in favor for military and veteran housing, and if they have vouchers, that's great, But the way it's written up is what's a concern for many people. So the way this Senate bill is written up is that it states very boldly that a landlord cannot discriminate against a housing voucher because it's a source of income for the veteran or for current military. Well, that specific language in the bill would then set precedents for the next bill that would likely come up. And if a housing voucher is considered a source of income for the tenant, well, that would apply to Section 8 as well and any other housing voucher program. So now, if this passes, which it likely will pass, it then sets precedents for the next debate, the next argument, the next battle, which would be, well, if a housing voucher is a source of income, can a landlord still have the right to deny a Section 8 applicant on a property? Because that's also very common. Many landlords will say, well, we don't want Section 8. And they say that for various reasons. And I've done podcasts in the past where I talk about the reasons why landlords don't want Section 8. And one of the biggest issues is not the fact that they don't like to participate in the program, is that the program just takes forever to get an inspection done or move in, and they just take forever, and a landlord loses 2 or 3 months worth of rent just waiting for housing to get their paperwork together. And recently HUD just had their budget cut, and funding for Section 8 is being cut, and so they're completely understaffed now, and we're starting to see the effects from it. So landlords historically have always been able to say no to Section 8 if they wanted to. It's a voluntary program. And this Senate Bill 1427 would definitely help veterans and military status, which is good, but then it sets precedents for the next argument, and we would likely see the current law that's enacted in San Francisco eventually go statewide, where it would be discriminatory to say no to Section 8. And of course, that would fall under fair housing rights. So extreme violations if you're a licensed individual, agent, or property manager or broker, and you would basically discriminate against people and telling them no to housing vouchers. Quick update on support animals. This is a big topic across state because right now tenants are able to go online or even have a relative put a letter together stating that their animal is a comfort or support animal, and that right now is legally okay in California as documentation. But the problem is people are abusing it and taking advantage of it. There's a case of someone down in Southern California that had a llama that wanted to bring their llama onto a single family house, and they had a letter that they bought for $50 online that said it was their comfort support animal. So there was a bill a year ago that was going through the state that would require a local medical practitioner to actually issue the letter certifying that the animal was a comfort support animal. Well, it was going to pass, but it got thrown in with some other stuff that did not pass, and then it lost basically the steam, the heat of the bill going through the state legislature. So now it's actually been referred over to the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. Now they're expected to make a decision sometime in the fall of this year, and they're supposed to come down with a decision that will clarify what qualifies an animal as a comfort support animal and what would be required for a tenant to submit documentation to a landlord. So we're going to hopefully have an answer on this by the end of this year and have more clarification on what landlords can accept or what landlords are allowed to accept. Also with the Department of Fair Employment and Housing is a decision on criminal history. There's a big push by some tenant groups right now that would make it discriminatory to deny a tenant applicant based on criminal history. So you would not be able to deny based on certain, and the problem is this is very vague. So if someone comes and they have a felony, or, one example is what if they're a sex offender and you cannot deny them housing, but then you are on the hook for liability for renting to them because of the knowledge of the criminal history. And so it's a really big sensitive debate. This too is going with the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, and they too will be making a decision on this later this year. One very odd bill that, and it's actually a modification to Prop 65. Now, Prop 65, if you don't know what that is, it's the warning signs that you see everywhere in restaurants, in office spaces, and office buildings that state that this building may contain cancer-causing materials such as blah, 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 blah. And these are small signs, but you see them basically everywhere. And they're very common in commercial, office, industrial, warehouse buildings. Now, there's a modification that if it passes, it would require this Prop 65 warning to be on every exterior door of every rental property. Now, this is a bit unique because can you imagine driving down a neighborhood and every rental property on the front door will have a Prop 65 warning, and not just the front door, but also the back exterior door or the side garage door. Or if you have an apartment building, let's say 10-unit apartment building, every door there is going to be required to have a Prop 65 warning posted right on the door. I think it's a little excessive and this is just over the top, but we'll see where this goes. Doesn't seem to have a lot of support, but we'll see where this ends up later this year. Assembly Bill 2681. So this is something that is completely. I was completely surprised by this one, but it's for potentially vulnerable buildings. This would require statewide that cities and counties make a list of every building in their city that would be considered vulnerable. Now, what does that mean? It's extremely vague, but there's certain requirements that the state would list, which basically, I mean, one of the requirements is if the building is older than 1996, you're automatically on the list. So many properties are going to be on this list, and cities and counties are required to keep track of these vulnerable buildings. Now, with this, and what's really odd is that 3 counties are exempt: Monterey County, San Diego County, and another third county, which I'm not quite sure why they would be exempt from this, but they just are. So this would also exclude hospitals, schools, and government buildings. And when I tell you what the requirements are going to be, you're gonna laugh why the government is making their own buildings exempt from this. So once on the list, your property will be listed as a vulnerable building. Okay, and this is going to be for any building that's 5 or more residential units. So if you're a single family house up to duplex, triplex, fourplex, you would be exempt as the way it's written up today. But anything that's 5 and more units, you would be on that list. Now, once on this list, you're required, if you wanted to be off this list, you have 1 year from when it's enacted, and it's expected to be enacted in, I believe, 2021 or 2022. But you have 1 year to have an engineer inspect your building and then submit a report to the state and to the city or county, whoever's tracking your property, and state that the building meets certain requirements that would make it exempt from being tracked on a vulnerable building list. So, for example, maybe you've retrofitted your building for earthquake, and that would be an exemption. So you would have 1 year from when this is enacted to get that done. Otherwise, you have to have a professional engineer inspect the property by 2025. So this is simply put, this Assembly bill will make it a requirement for any residential building 5 units or more to be inspected by an engineer by 2025 and a report submitted to the state. Now, here's the other problem with this. And I'm guessing the reason why this is making its way through the state legislature is because as buildings get older, they want to make sure buildings are retrofitted and are not vulnerable in case of a major earthquake. So I get the whole idea behind it, but this is going to cause many problems and let me explain this a bit further. Once you're on this list, a city or county, even the state, once they've identified your property as being vulnerable, they can go in and enact other ordinances that then take the inspection further. So most likely, the way we've seen the trend go with many government agencies passing ordinances and inspection laws, this engineer report is only the beginning. You're going to be required possibly to do a wide range of various inspections based on what the city or the county wants you to do once you're on this vulnerable list. And so it's going to be very costly because it's going to require a lot more inspections. So that's really the worry. And then what's your liability of once being on the vulnerable list? Do you have to disclose this to any new buyer purchasing the property? What are the requirements for holding inspections, or are inspections filed with the state? What if you go to sell a property and the real estate agent who's responsible for pulling up these reports and disclosing them? And there's just a lot of problems that are going to come out of this. So it's going to be really important to be on top of list one to see what happens. And they're apparently, once it passes, they're going to send out a letter to every property owner to let them know their property has been identified as vulnerable. So we'll see really what cities and counties do with it, because statewide level, they're just going to require a list. But at the city county level, they may require a lot more inspections, depending on, if you make that list. Assembly Bill 2219. This is third-party payments. So historically, if you're a landlord and your tenant is Joe Smith, and Joe Smith wanted to have Sarah Thompson write a check and pay for Joe Smith's rent, you as a landlord historically could say no. As a landlord, you could tell Joe Smith, you must pay the rent. You cannot have other third parties pay rent, because the fear is that if a third party pays rent, then is a tenancy then created at that point. So that's a big worry. However, Assembly Bill 2219 would actually make it illegal for a landlord to deny a tenant to pay using a third party. So this is going to be an interesting bill to watch, because you may, later on this year, you may not be able to deny a third party, and you may have to accept that third party payment. But the biggest battle here, and I think most landlords would agree that, hey, if the rent's being paid, it's not a big deal. But it can be a big deal, because the question now comes, does that third party have any tenancy right if they're paying for the rent? So that's not made clear by the Assembly Bill, and hopefully it gets modified later in order to clarify that. Assembly Bill 2343, real property possession unlawful detainer. So this is one bill that could cause a lot of problems. So right now, let me explain how current law is set. So right now, if a tenant the tenant is usually required to pay rent on the first of every month. Usually, per the lease agreement, you're going to have a 3 to 5 day grace period. My leases have a 5-day grace period. So, for example, tenant is required to pay rent on the first, but they have a 5-day grace period. So they can pay up until the 5th without any penalties. After the 5th, if they haven't paid, their rent is now considered late. On the 6th, I can serve them a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. Now, this 3-day notice gives them another 3 days to pay rent within those 3 days. If they do not pay rent by the time that 3-day notice expires, we can then legally file an unlawful detainer, which is also known as an eviction. And then at that point, we can go ahead, evict the tenant for non-payment of rent. What Assembly Bill 2343 does is it would require that 3-day notice to pay rent or quit to be extended to a 10-day notice, meaning it basically gives the tenant up to the middle of the month to pay their rent without any penalties. Now, I think if you're a tenant, you know when rent's due, you know how much rent is due, and usually rent's going to be due on the 1st. If you can't pay it, you have a 3 or 5 day grace period, depending on what your lease agreement states. And If you still don't pay it, it's late, and you're given another 3 days to pay it. Now, this would extend to 10 days. I think that's excessive. I mean, do people really need 10 days or 15 days total to pay their rent? And the problem is, what if this happens every single month? Now, after 3 or 4, usually you can evict someone for habitual late payment, but still, you're dealing with late payments, and they have up until the middle of the month if this passes. Now, on the other side too, you have a 3-day notice to cure or quit. So, for example, if your tenant is causing lease violations, let's say, for example, your tenant's parking their car on the front lawn. Well, obviously, that's a lease violation. They're damaging the property, and you don't want them to park on the lawn anymore. So, as of today, you give them a 3-day notice to pay, or sorry, a 3-day notice to cure or quit. Basically, they have 3 days to cure that violation, or you then have the right to evict them. Well, does it really take 3 days to move your car off the lawn and put it onto the street or driveway or garage? No. That can be done in 25 minutes, or even less, 5 minutes. This Assembly Bill 2343 would then require you to give a 5-day notice to cure or quit. So it extends those notices to 10 and 5-day respectively, and obviously this is not good. It really extremely favors problem tenants. Assembly Bill 2618. This is mandatory property management certification. So my personal opinion on this, I'm kind of torn 50-50 on this, and let me explain what this is. Beginning in 2020, every landlord and property manager would be required to take certification programs on housing practices, landlord obligations, tenant rights. This is every landlord. So even if you own your own property and manage your own property, whether it's a single family house, 5-unit building, 10, 15, 20-unit building, if you're a manager for someone, or if you own the building and you're self-managing, you will be required to take this certification program that you have to renew every 2 years. Again, I'm 50-50 on this because I get why they want to put this program. It's to cover housing practices, landlord obligations, and tenant rights. But then it crosses the border at, well, what point is an owner of a property allowed to self-manage their own property? If I own a rental property, I should be allowed to manage it by myself and not have to be required to do any certification classes in order to manage a property by myself. Now, on the flip side, it would be good to have certification because there's so many landlords that are not familiar and up to date with current laws. And a mandatory program would help them get closer to knowing all the various laws in place, especially on a state level. So many properties that I get transitioned over to me are extremely poorly managed, and not really in the housing practices or tenant rights section, but landlord obligations when it comes to repairs. There's a lot of lack of landlord required repairs or disclosures and paperwork that buildings are just poorly managed, and whether it's by another management company, a realtor, or the owner themselves. And when I take over the property, I'm making a list of all the corrections we need to do, and we get the building fixed up and corrected. So I think, I'm torn on this one. I'd have to wait for more information to see what kind of certification this would be. I mean, if it's a cheap $10, $15, $20 certification course that someone can do online, it might be okay. If it's something much more complicated, then at what point are you preventing people from managing their own properties? Something like this would probably benefit managers, because if a homeowner doesn't want to do a certification course, they're going to have to hire a property manager that does have that certification. And then the other argument too is property managers have to be licensed brokers. And we go through this type of training already to get our real estate license and to renew our real estate license every 4 years. We're required to do this type of training anyway. So this would be repetitive training for brokers. And so why would brokers and property managers have to do this? So this is going to be a very interesting assembly bill to watch down the road and see how it develops. And the last assembly bill I want to talk about is Assembly Bill 2925, and this is just cause evictions. Now, in many cities, mainly the ones with rent control, they also have what's called a just cause ordinance. Now, this just cause ordinance basically states in order for a landlord to evict a tenant, they have to have a good cause, a just cause, in order to evict them. This would be, for example, if the tenant's damaging the property, if the tenant's not paying rent, if the owner wants to move back into the property, if the owner wants to get out of the rental market and sell the property, if the tenant is drug dealing or doing illegal activities, etc. So there has to be a good cause. Now, every jurisdiction that's enacted some type of just cause will list the just causes. So, for example, in the city of Richmond, they have 7 just cause reasons, and you can go to the Richmond website and look at those just cause reasons in their ordinance. It flat out tells you exactly what the just causes are. The problem with Assembly Bill 2925 is that this just cause ordinance has no just cause reasons. In fact, it just simply says good faith basis. Well, what's a good faith basis? Anyone's going to argue that a landlord evicting you is evicting you based on not on a good faith basis. So every single eviction will end up going to trial and have to have a judge or a jury decide on whether non-payment of rent is really a good cause. And so it's very vague. So if this assembly bill is even going to move forward, it needs to be revised in order to list what the just causes are. But at the same time, just cause makes it extremely difficult for landlords in any jurisdiction to evict a tenant other than just cause. And the quick argument to that is, well, why would a tenant or why would a landlord want to evict someone for anything other than non-payment of rent? Well, what if the tenant is doing illegal activity? What if the owner wants to sell the property? And there's various reasons, but with just cause, even though one of the just causes in an ordinance might be, oh, because of drug activity or illegal activity, you can evict them, it's not that easy. You have to prove it in court. You have to prove that as a just cause. Well, if the person has people coming and going from their apartment, they're doing the drug dealing from inside the apartment, there's no way you're going to be able to get proof unless you're going in there and buying the drugs yourself and recording it yourself. And you're not going to do that as a landlord. And tenants aren't going to snitch on the person doing the illegal activity out of fear. And there's not going to be a way to build proof when you have a just cause ordinance. And so what happens is you end up with a lot of bad tenants that are able to get away with many different things. Whereas if there was no just cause, if there was enough indication that showed, hey, there's something weird going on here, likely drug activity, even if the person has, and one thing with just cause, even if the person has a record of being arrested or is a known drug dealer, unless you have proof, you still can't evict them. You don't have a just cause. Especially if they were not arrested on site. Maybe they were arrested off site for drug dealing. That doesn't matter. So it's much more difficult to evict people when there's a just cause eviction. And I know the biggest concern is, well, if I'm a good tenant and I pay my rent on time, I don't want to be evicted. And I totally get that. And guess what? Most landlords are not going to evict you if you're a good tenant and pay your rent on time. Most evictions in court are done because of non-payment of rent. That's a fact that anyone can look up in the courts and the evictions and go sit down in courts and watch case after case. Most evictions are done because of non-payment of rent. So if you're paying your rent, you're a good tenant, your landlord's likely not going to evict you. So those are the various different bills going through the California state legislature. Maybe I'll put together an update around October, November to let you know, probably November, to let you know what actually passed. But it seems like a lot of these items are going to pass the way they're written up or with amendments. So a lot of this stuff kicks in 2019 or 2020. So it'd be very important to watch these items because it will affect your business and your rights as a property owner.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Thank you to our producer, Sam Levin. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share the podcast. Remember, you can listen to the podcast on iTunes, Podbean, iHeartRadio, Google Play, SoundCloud, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. For more information on my business as a property manager and real estate team, go visit my website at marcguzman.com. I really want to thank all of you for listening. It means the world to me, and I hope today's episode provides you value in your day-to-day life. I created this podcast to help showcase the many great people that live in this world and help share some knowledge that I've learned along the way in life. Again, thank you for listening. Check out our sponsors, and I'll catch you on the next episode.